Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Futures, a Northern Caucus. Thank you for joining us for Deadass, Reclaiming the Black Queer Experience. My name is Shayna. My pronouns are she, her, and elle en français, and I'm part of the board of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Before we get started with this panel, we would like to acknowledge that BLM Sudbury is located on the unceded territories of the Anishinaabe, specifically in Swakamock, which means where the three roads meet in Anishinaabe-Moan. This area was later renamed Sudbury by settlers who came to these lands. This is Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory and is the home place of the Tikmashing Anishinaabeg and the Wahnapitae First Nations. This treaty territory is also home to the Oji Cree, Mishkegowuk Cree, Algonquin, and Métis peoples. I want to acknowledge that the people who have and continue to live on these lands have resisted, in many ways, shapes, and forms, colonial violence that permeated this country for centuries and continue to thrive even within neocolonialism, actively engaging in efforts towards decolonization and striving for self-determination. Here at Black Lives Matter Sudbury, we recognize that reconciliation does not begin and end with a simple land acknowledgement. We must work to actively decolonize spaces and uplift Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. In addition, we must all aid in the ongoing battle for Indigenous sovereignty, access to clean drinking water, and seek justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals. I would also like to acknowledge the legacy of slavery in this country and the enslaved African people whose labor was exploited for generations to help establish the colonial lands we now call Canada. Slavery existed in this country until 1834, and it is essential to recognize how the history of this country is complicit in racist and white supremacist systems. We must also acknowledge that the end of slavery was followed by a series of ongoing discriminatory and repressive practices and laws, effects of which are still experienced to this day. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that though February marks Black History Month, uplifting the contributions of Black people and communities must continue every day of the year, even here on March 2nd. It is important to recognize this time as an opportunity to educate yourself, your family, and your friends on the historic contributions of Black communities on Turtle Island. We'd also like to take a moment to thank our conference sponsors. It is because of their generosity that we've been able to thrive and present important programming like this caucus within our northern community. Biographies of our panel participants and a full list of our conference sponsors can be found on our website, www.blmsudbury.ca. We are pleased to offer ASL interpretation for each panel provided by the Sign Language Interpreting Associates of Ottawa, SLIAO. We are also offering simultaneous translation, so if you need to hear this in French, please choose that as well. Black Futures, a Northern Caucus artwork, was commissioned by Coyote Jonathan Akande and represents themes of Afrofuturism. Our moderator for this panel is Perdicou, registered social worker, psychotherapist, and owner of Perdicou Psychotherapy. Our panel consists of Tsholo, Khalema, Shanese and Steele, and C.G. Smith. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And without further ado, here's your moderator, Perdicou.
Great, thank you very much, Shayna, for that introduction. So we will just jump right in and get underway with my lovely panelists. And start with the first question, which is hopefully going to be the easiest one. I believe all the panelists can pop on their cameras now as well. Hopefully the easiest question, like I said, can you start us off by telling us a bit about yourselves? Anybody can start.
I'll go. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Tsholo Khalema, and I am an actor, director, trans man from South Africa. and I am so very pleased to be here. I've been in the industry in terms of acting and the arts for about 20 odd years and have experienced many different intersections through that. And so I'm really pleased to be here to have conversations. Thank you so much.
Amazing, thank you. Shanese or Christopher, either one of you can come up next.
I can go next. Anine, hello everybody. My name is Shanese Steele. I am a Afro-Indigenous activist, writer, educator, and community member, which I think is the most important part of all of that. I'm also a Virgo, which I think is also extremely important. But I have been doing activism and community work, well, really community work since I was a small child, but activism in itself since I was 18 years old. So that's 12 years now of doing this work. I have worked both in the Canadian sector as well as in America and also globally. I did a lot of work with the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. And most of my work is focused on building relationships and conversations between Black and Indigenous people, because oftentimes that gets left out. And then I'm also a queer activist. So I've spent a lot of time creating space for queer individuals, specifically in the post-secondary area, but also around having conversations about queerness and Caribbean identity. So that's a bit about me. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. And Christopher, you are up.
Hi, I'm Christopher Smith. I've worn many hats, and so I'm going to try and keep this brief, but currently I work as an academic. I teach at University of Toronto in the program in Women and Gender Studies at University of Toronto Scarborough, but I'm also a research associate at the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, while simultaneously being program coordinator for the Queer and Trans Research Lab, or QTRL. I've also worked as a consultant for 20 years in different capacities, primarily with nonprofit organizations. I mean, two examples would be the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, where I worked on their anti-homophobia modules for different community service agencies. And then more recently, working with what is now Toronto Metropolitan University, but used to be Ryerson University, reviewing their anti-Black racism campus climate review. And so, yeah, and I'm also a writer. I'm imagining myself as a poet right now, because we need some creative energy after these last couple of years. So, but feel free to ask me anything else.
Wonderful, thank you very much. You all sound super, super busy. So I'm excited to get to spend all this time with you all and get asking some of these questions and hopefully have some lovely conversation. So the next question I want to ask is about all of your understanding with reclaiming Black queer experience. So when we talk about reclaiming the Black queer experience, what is it that might come to mind for you? And again, we can hop to whoever wants to take it on first.
I'll jump in. You know, for me, the Black queer experience historically has been marginalized and overlooked in so many intersections that I've experienced. And even though there's a growing movement to reclaim all of that, or to center those experiences, it's not quite there yet. The queer individuals, such as myself, being a Black trans man, I face many unique and challenging experiences and intersections of racism and homophobia, transphobia, all kinds of different things. Do I think that reclaiming the Black queer experience involves everybody acquiring knowledge about who we are? That also means celebrating historically the people that have been there, that contributed to the Black queer in experience and movement socially and so forth.
Anybody else want up next? Shanese, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I think for me, when I think of like what is reclaiming like queer Black culture, I'm specifically looking at it from like that of a queer Caribbean person. And so for me, it's been very similar to what has been said, is like creating the space for queer Caribbean folks to highlight how present they've been in Caribbean culture. And so one of those things is during Carnival, and in particular during Jab Jab, as someone who comes from the Grenadines. My father is from Carriacou, Grenada and Trinidad, but Carriacou is a part of the Grenadines. And something that I think has been really beautiful is around queer dressing during Carnival and seeing queer individuals being able to reclaim some of those acts of ceremony. And I look at Carnival as ceremony, reclaiming some of those spaces and being themselves. I've been seeing queer carnivals happening in Jamaica and in Trinidad, right? That's different than a pride parade, right? It's really reclaiming that aspect of Carnival, which I think is so beautiful. It looks like creating costumes that are, you know, gender neutral, that anybody can wear, and not policing who gets to wear that. My favorite part of Jab Jab is seeing men who normally wouldn't, you know, play with their gender expression, wearing clothes that are typically seen as femme, right? As women's clothing. So I think for me, that's what reclaiming looks like. I think when we're talking about like the broader conversation of reclaiming Black queer culture, I think for me is really, you know, the type of shows that we're seeing that are starting to really highlight ballroom, and specifically Black ballroom. I think a lot of times we see a lot of white queers, right, perpetuating Black queer culture. So yes, queen, all of that, right, which is like very popular on TikTok, the white queers. But seeing that highlighted through ballroom, I think has been a beautiful expression of reclamation. But I do agree that I don't think we've gone far enough yet, and I think we're starting to like take the steps of reclaiming that.
And so I mean, in concert with both of you, where I'm just like, yeah, I'm totally feeling you. And so like, Shanice, when you were saying like, yes, queen, like, I just like, there's a very kind of pernicious way in which Black queer culture seeps into something that we would arbitrarily call the mainstream, when in fact, we've always been front and center, but just never got credit. Like, and so, but when I was thinking about this question earlier, and part of me as an academic, as a scholar, as a researcher, I'm always curious about the ways in which our histories get narrated by someone else. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which, like right now in our present moment, I'm seeing like a plethora of like memes celebrating Marsha P. Johnson or Ruth Ellis, like prominent figures within Black queer history, and thinking about who is utilizing or taking up these particular figures in order to tell a particular kind of story of liberation that is not as nuanced as the way in which it would be told if it was either told by Black scholars or just Black people on the ground that are just like, yeah, I remember Marsha, or I remember Ruth, or anyone else that was a significant figure within their life, but does not somehow enter the popular imagination. And so for me, when I think about the notion of reclaiming, it's about creating the environment and I guess the infrastructure for us to be able to direct the narrative as not one of just mere inclusion. Like, oh, you see these, you know, Black folks were queer too. It's like, I mean, interestingly, like this afternoon, I came across a post on Facebook that was like addressing Gabrielle Union and Dwayne Wade's trans daughter. And one of the speakers on, I think it's CBS This Morning or whatever the show is, talked about how, well, trans people have been here since 1968 or 1969 with the Stonewall riots, and they reference Marsha P. Johnson. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm pretty sure we were here before then. And as a Canadian, I'm thinking, first and foremost, hello, Jackie Shane, right? And so for me, when I think about reclaiming, I'm also thinking about ensuring that there is not an erasure. And so, I mean, but we can totally like continue with this conversation, but that's my first response to that question.
If I may add to that, what you said there, in terms of narrative, it's I think to push that and to create it, the thought of creating more stories about queer people and queer stories, we need to see that more in media. There's a huge problem in terms of storytelling and the kind of narrative that we see. Me as myself, I don't see a lot of narratives that showcase experiences that I relate to, even within the Black experience. So also looking within and finding out what we can do as Black people in terms of creating those safe spaces for everyone is important. And that includes our theaters need to start doing more in terms of including queerness within our spaces and films and just the arts in general. Even music, we need all of that because those are the things that influence society a lot in terms of how the narrative goes in terms of Black and queer intersections. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add off of what both of you have said. I think like oftentimes when we talk about reclaiming, right, it feels like something that's been stolen. And when I think of like Black queer culture, I think of the way in which we're continuously changing and growing. And it's like almost like every time something's taken, we're like, oh honey, you can have that. We're gonna build something else. Right. And I also, there's something beautiful in that, in the fact that like we're able to create culture, because most culture, Black culture, is based in Black queerness, no matter where you go, right? We're creating language, we're creating art, we're creating music, we're creating all of these things. And I think oftentimes about, you know, it's almost like we're kind of like phoenixes, right? Like we've burned in the ashes and we've come out and we've built something more beautiful and even greater, right? And I think that's like, again, that's something that's beautiful about that. And sometimes I'm like, I don't even want to take it back. Take it, you've ruined it, right? How many times have we talked about like the fact that like mainstream people have just like ruined something? We saw that happen with the dab, which is technically not queer culture, but we saw it as Black folks, right? And I just love the fact that we're so able to regenerate and build even more beautiful things. And I think that's kind of the beautiful aspect of Black queer culture, is that no matter what you try to take, we're always going to come with something better and bigger.
I mean, to kind of extend that, especially when, and I love that point that you're making, Shanese, and also Tsholo, like there's something wonderful and beautiful about the way in which we reinvent and improvise. And I'm thinking right now, like as you were talking, one of the ending speakers, Angela Davis in Marlon Riggs' Black is Black Ain't, where, you know, if you were ever to define Blackness, it's like we can reinvent, reinvigorate. And so that is like a profound source of political power, cultural power, but also just everyday, just life power that like, yeah, because like, I know there's a moment where I'm just kind of like, you know, I'll be walking in like, well, I live in Toronto. So, you know, I'll be walking in the Church Wellesley Village and, you know, seeing white queens talking about, yes, queen. And I'm just kind of like, yeah, I don't even want to do that anymore because you just like, again, you for real just ruined it for me. Like at best, I think I only use yes in text now among other Black queer folks. Like I no longer make a public exclamation of yes, like, unless I'm on a dance floor and then I'm just like, oh my God, girl, that's my jam. Like, but there's just a very interesting way in which, and I guess it's also something to think about in terms of, again, when we're talking about reclaiming, because I know for myself in all of my years being, you know, in queer life in different ways, what does it mean when folks are finding connections with each other through Black popular culture, Black queer popular culture, in our everyday lives on the dance floor, on the street, what sorts of gestures are trying to be made. And for me, it's always been a question of, is this convivial? Like, are you actually, like, are we sharing and trying to create something together? Or is this about you increasing your cool factor because you would not otherwise know yourself as hip, up to date, so on and so forth? And so, yeah, it's an ongoing, I think for me, it's an ongoing conversation. And so again, this question around reclaiming, again, I'm glad that all three of us are thinking about like what that actually means, because again, Shanice, I love like how you said, like, yeah, you know what, take it, go with it.
Sorry, but there's also the idea of history and finding ways to retell the history. I find that so important, especially with theater. One thing I spending money at student loan, learning Eurocentric ways of educating myself in acting or directing or all those things, but craving to hear my languages still on these stages and teaching other people about the sounds. Just as simple as the sound of my own name. We can teach that. We can teach sounds to human beings. And so why is it that we only see certain narrative from history? Even though we're in Black future, we still have to think about how can we reteach or retell our stories the proper way, the right way, the proper histories that have been lost. That's very important to me. And I feel like that's part of reclaiming who we are, is retelling our history the way that that it actually happened. You know, it's not taught in schools. It's certainly not taught in universities either. Like when I was taking theater, there wasn't any options for Black history in terms of theater or even Indigenous history because of theater. You know, a lot of the classes started when Columbus started. Like that's insane to me. And so going back and re-educating and figuring out how we can bring these stories back to relive it and educate others, you know, I feel like that's also very vital in reclaiming who we are. And yes, focusing on the future, but still looking back and seeing what did we miss? What have we been told that's false? Thank you.
I think it was Tsholo that maybe made a point that stuck out to me earlier. So before I move us on to the next question, I'm just curious if any of you would be comfortable speaking to, you know, we've been talking about the Black queer experience. I'm wondering if anybody would be comfortable speaking to how individuality or intersectionality works into the Black experience instead of it being kind of just a homogenous blob.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm curious how you might view like individuality or intersectionality and that how it interacts with the Black queer experience instead of looking, you know, I think there's 4 very different people here, 3 very different panelists, myself as moderator, different, and we probably have very different Black queer experiences. So I'm just curious how you might look at that.
I mean, I can answer that question from 2 different avenues, like one as an academic, but then also just in my own personal life in terms of knowing that there is no the Black queer experience. My research is on Black Pride festivals and specifically doing a comparison of Black Pride festivals that happen in UK, in the States, but then also situating Blockorama in Toronto as part of Toronto's Black Pride events, Toronto's Pride events in relationship with each other, and thinking about the ways in which there is a multitude or a multiverse of Black queer experience. And that understanding has shaped how I do my research, but also in my doing, like the embodied way in which I was inspired to even do the research just by living my life, going to like, you know, Pride festivals in Detroit or hanging out in DC or wherever, thinking about the ways in which what I think is Black queer is going to change as soon as I land on the ground. And so I think for me, I mean, I guess one way to answer that question is that we should always be open to the possibility that when we encounter each other, we will change each other. And hopefully for the better. Just by virtue, if we're able to have that opportunity to share experiences, to get a better understanding of what it is that we're all seeking for a better future.
Thank you. I love the way that you put that. Thank you, appreciate it. Yeah, Tsholo, did you have something out there?
Yeah, I feel like there's about 33 or odd people in this room right now listening, and we're all individuals and we're all listening. We all have opinions about, you know, how life should be. Humans are not a monolith, and queerness is not a monolith. Queer people are very different from one another. We have different views, you know, and that we also need to talk about creating safe spaces within that as well, you know. So the thing I could say is that we are all different, and we all of us have to acknowledge our differences and really love our differences. The world should really just love, honestly, and love equals acceptance. And it's fun getting to know people. I can't imagine a world where we were all the same. It would be so boring. There wouldn't be any TikTok, because what's the point? You know, it's all of that kind of stuff. I just think that we need to continue to tell our stories, continue to tell different narratives of queerness, and celebrate that loudly so people know that people are here and we're all different. I think right now, especially with film, there's a narrow version of who's who. Yes, there's, you know, Blackness has broken some barriers, but then there's still the Black queer experiences that are still having this narrow mind of, or not us having a narrow mind, but other people, the lens that looks at our stories is very narrow, you know. And so the more we show, the more we tell, the more people realize that we are not a monolith and that we can live many different lives, even in the queer spectrum, even in the trans spectrum, which is something that I advocate for in film, that at the end of the day, we can't call all trans people for the same role. There is so many different identities within that. But it's almost like that's a misstep, because the world is almost not there. We're still dealing with the surprise, you know, of what happened in 2020. But it's like all of these things have been happening. We've been saying all of these things. Everything that we're saying even today is nothing new. It's just maybe there will find room for people to listen to the differences, or to allow the differences to happen within the queer spectrum, or the Black spectrum, the human spectrum. Thank you.
And yeah, I just wanted to add to both what CG said and Tsholo as well, is that when I think of, you know, Black queerness, right? And I'm thinking about it in like the aspect of liberation. It's important to acknowledge those differences in Black queer liberation, because it's going to look different no matter where you are. What I need as a Black queer person in Canada is different than what even a Black queer person needs in the United States, than what a Black queer person needs in the Caribbean, even though I'm a Black queer Caribbean person, right? But I live in a different place. So my activism is going to look different. Of course, I want queer people across the globe, right, to be free from oppression and homophobia and transphobia, right, and all the violence that we face, but it's going to look different. And I can't tell someone from somewhere else how they should be fighting for their liberation, or what they need, or what activism looks like for them. And I think that's why we need to acknowledge those differences, is because if we're going to find liberation for all of us, then we need to account for all of the different ways we need to be liberated, right? And again, our colonizers might share the same language and might share the same skin tone, but they might act very different based on how they can act where they are, right? So acknowledging that, I think, is really important. because otherwise we're not going to have actual liberation. Because like folks have said, you're just going to be fighting for one type of queer person, Black queer person, right? When we're even talking about representation, yes, there's been strides in Black queer representation, right? But when I think of specifically studs, right, masculine Black women, I don't see that much representation. Lena Waithe, okay, maybe I think there's one actress in Harlem who's like who's a stud, and even then she's more like a STEM. It's not, right? Like effectively Black masculine women, queer women, have been erased from the queer conversation. We do not acknowledge them at all. They are not included in anything. My partner never gets to see herself in film, in representation, right? So when we're even talking about the differences in how we identify, we're both Black queer women. But I know when I turn on a show, if they're going to have a Black queer woman, especially being light skinned, I'm going to see me. But my girlfriend is not going to see herself as a darker brown skinned Black masculine woman. She's just not going to see it, right? So I think it's really interesting in the way that we'll see white butches, right? But we won't see Black studs. So I think that is also a conversation of like differences, is even when we're talking about, you know, reclaiming Black queer culture and we're talking about representation, oftentimes we're missing folks like that, or trans women who haven't transitioned in the way that society says they need to transition. Where are their voices? How come we don't see them, right? It's so easy to find trans folks that fit the binary, but what about trans folks who don't, right? Again, there's so many Black queer voices who are completely being lost or erased or silenced, even when we're fighting for representation. And again, it goes back to who's in the room. And if they're not in the room and they don't have someone there to advocate on behalf of them, those differences are going to get lost.
Especially in Canada.
Especially, yes, 100%.
Yeah, it's often looked, even in entertainment, they look outside of Canada to find what they need to bring it in. But it's still not a proper representation of who we are. And you're absolutely right about masculinity. It's absolutely, especially Blackness in terms of queer masculinity in women, it's erased. You don't see it.
Thank you, everybody. So let's build upon this conversation a little bit more by moving to the next question, where a lot of folks recognize queerness coded as white and Blackness, or queerness coded as white, Blackness coded as heterosexual. Has that shifted at all? Why or why not? Who wants to tackle that one first? Christopher, I see a big smile crossing your face. Can I tell you?
I will jump in, and now that I've become more acquainted with Zulu and Shanese, I'm just like, okay, I'll jump in because I'm just like, there's a part of me this afternoon where I'm just like, this question's a trap, because like, no, because it's a conversation that has been had and debated like in everyday culture, but also within academia. And so again, it kind of circles back to some of the earlier questions that we've been addressing. And I was just like, okay, well, I will say like, yes, it has shifted only because I have a certain intergenerational knowledge, because I was, I grew up in like the first culture wars in the 90s, like when universities didn't want to teach Toni Morrison. And then here we are in 2023, full circle, and like culture war, 2.0, they want to ban Toni Morrison, and even Black queer studies for that matter. Like, I mean, it's interesting to see the kind of debates that are happening in the States right now. But I do think it's shifted, and I think it actually is important that we acknowledge certain shifts, but then also think about particular questions we might ask. Sorry. Because, I mean, like we see like a shift in terms of, again, we're going back to popular culture and representation. So we have like folks like Lil Nas X, we have, all kinds of prominent pop culture figures, Queen Latifah, I don't know why I'm stuttering, because I know I had a list of them in my head. I was also going to say Debrat because I just found out that I think they're getting married and also having a baby. I can't remember, but just thinking about the ways in which like 30, 20, even 30 years ago, I would not have imagined these kinds of things happening. And so I would say it has shifted. But then the question is, has the only shift been visibility and who's able to be visible? Because queerness is still being coded as middle class or above. And that's a problem because again, we're not hearing about the day-to-day struggles of Black, queer, and trans folks who are living their lives in ways that I applaud. I know because I'm one of them, because I wasn't always in the position that I am now. Like, yeah, I'm gonna pause there because as you can tell, I'm a talker. And so if I keep on going with this train of thought, I could dominate the conversation, which is not my intent. So I'm gonna hush for now, but I'm just kind of curious because that was the main thing that just came to mind for me, is that we're still seeing, even within this proliferation of representation of Black, queer, and trans folks and their lives, these are all people who have a certain kind of economic security in order to be public. And this is not a question of whether or not like Black folks are out or not out and what does that mean. It's just simply sometimes being visible is dangerous. And so I'll leave it at that.
I'm loving the insightful commentary, Christopher. I can listen to you talk all day. We'll let one of the other two take over for you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, talk away. I'm definitely enjoying learning. I love hearing other people talk. I'm a talker too, so don't worry, we're in the same boat. But yeah, I think when I think of like the reason why it's been coded like that in the past, I think of like the laws that we have in place and the way in which we've policed queerness. And oftentimes the reason why queerness has been policed is because of homophobia within the white community, right? So when I think of the buggery law in the Caribbean, that was because white soldiers were sleeping with each other and others, right? White men soldiers, and bringing STDs back to their wives in the UK. That was the reason for the buggery law. It wasn't because they were policing Black queer people. It's because they were policing white queer people, right? And so I think that's oftentimes why a lot of us associate queerness with whiteness, because of the way in which queerness has been originally policed. Now, we can talk about historically when colonizers first arrived, right? Obviously, there was policing of queerness, but when I think of the laws that we have contemporary, in a contemporary sense, around, or not contemporary, I guess, what we had during that time, it was policing white folks, right? It was white folks' expression of queerness. Oftentimes, when we saw the policing of Black queerness or Indigenous queerness, it was through the church. Right? It wasn't necessarily through the lawman. When we think of a lot of the bathhouses, right, that were broken up back in the day, oftentimes it was white queers that they were showing all over TV. It wasn't Black queer people. So it was easy to code queerness as white. I think, like, is it shifting within the Black community? For me, it's interesting because growing up, it was always Black queer people that I saw. Like my representation of queerness was Black folks. Right? So my cousin, who's older, he's in his 50s, was the first Black gay man that I had known, right? And so I think for me, queerness has always been associated with Blackness for me personally, but I think for society as a whole, and I think for a lot of straight Black folks, cis Black folks, who have bought into this idea that like queerness came through slavery, it's very easy to dismiss it and code it as white. Right? And we can obviously understand the history of violence, of sexual violence done by slave owners and masters and colonizers and all of these things. And we can understand where some of that pain comes from. But I think because we haven't had the space as a community to heal from even that, it's hard for us to have conversations as a community to talk about how to heal around our queerness, right? And what does that mean? What does it mean to, again, go back to reclaiming a lot of that queer history that has been erased, right? I often hear people say, again, queerness came through slavery. Well, no, I could give you a handful of nations on the continent that had queer individuals, queer people, queer sacred people, queer people who were simply just existing, right? But that's been erased in the same way that African spirituality has been erased for a lot of us in the diaspora, and not actually just in the diaspora, but also on the continent, right? The way in which Christianity has come through and erased a lot of our traditional teachings around gender and expression and identity. Our languages and the way that that's changed, right? Oftentimes when we translate it to English, it doesn't even actually articulate what our words for ourselves in our languages were. I'm Indigenous on my mom's side, and when I think of the word for woman, kwe, it doesn't actually translate to woman. It translates to person who's constantly in transition, right? Do you see the difference in that, in what those are and how you, what those are and how you would connect to that as a person, right? Because being a woman, there's all of these things that come with that. Being a person who's constantly in transition, I am. My body's constantly changing, my mood's constantly changing, my sexuality is constantly changing, right? All of these things, but it's even altered the way I relate to myself through language. And so I think when we're talking about this shift of like Blackness being coded as queer from being coded as heteronormative, we have to look back at what are our original words for ourselves, our language. And again, back to like queer femme, well, not queer femme, but queer masculinity in women, even the word stud, and how that's been stolen by white queers. And I'm so sorry if there's any white queer masculine people in this space, you are not a stud. That is a term that is for Black queer women specifically, right? So I think reclaiming language is how we shift the conversation around what's coded as what. Again, goes back to that reclaiming of Black queer culture, understanding that all of that language that white queers are using started by Black people, right? And I think we're starting again to see that shift a bit. I don't know if we're fully there yet, but I do think folks are having more conversation around queerness in Black community than we were having before. And actually, I should say we were probably having it before, we just weren't allowed to be as vocal as we are now. But I definitely think that there is a bit of a shift, right? Like I don't even consider white queers anymore. I'm like, y'all are off over there. You'll at some point take what we've created over here, but like they're no longer who I look to when I think of what I want to see as a queer future. I don't need to see any more old queer white people. I want to see old queer Black people in happy couples with families, right? Whether that's a dog or it's just the two of them, or they have 6 kids, because queer people can also have 6 kids, right? Instead of just the normal 1 or 2. Like that's what I want to see. So for me, I think it's about individually, we have to start coding queerness as Black, right? Because sometimes we do it ourselves. When we think of what does queerness look like, it's usually a white gay person with, certain piercings and certain hairstyles and dressed a certain way. And I'm like, that too has also been stolen from Black queer folks, right? So like changing our minds as well.
Thank you. Tsholo, anything to add to that?
Mic drop. That's all. No, that's not all. But honestly, you hit it on, Shanese. Everything that I just wanted to just say, you said it. I was gonna say, let's go back to the Bible, that Black book that, was given. That, in my opinion, as a minister's kid, it has nothing to do with, it doesn't have queerness in it. And so that's the thing that we were taught, to read, to understand, to follow, to believe in, to trust that book, and that book excluded people like me. People use that book to punish people like myself and other queer folks, and so I don't really have anything new to add, except for that, the fact that we do need to change queerness, Blackness, and think about Black queer people, because we do exist in many different intersections, and we're still here, and that it no longer should be considered a white thing. I grew up in a world where there was no mention of queerness. I grew up in South Africa. There was nothing. There was once a year, there would be a few people that would dress up in women's clothing, and they would run around the town, and it was looked at as something that was funny and not something that was celebrated. And that's what I grew up in. And so when I came to Canada, everything was, a white thing, including queerness, including learning disabilities, including any of that stuff. Depression is whiteness. So we've associated all of these things to whiteness, but there are things that really, you know, like queerness, where we exist. What are you gonna do? Erase us? You can't. We help you with marches. We help you with a lot. Queer people are at the forefront of so much, you know? And so, yeah, I everything was just said so eloquently. But I just wanted to add that piece, is that absolutely 100%, we need to change the narrative of what queerness is within the Black community. That's why I said we need to really create those spaces within us, have those conversations, you know, have, you know, more conversations where all women talk and talk to one another and figure out what's going on, you know, trans women, cis women, all kinds of women, even trans men, with cis men. Everybody needs to have conversation, non-binary people within Blackness, to know that we're here, you know, and that it does exist within that, the Black scope, the Black lens. And that's why I'm big on storytelling and seeing ourselves in these narratives, because we need to do more. I want to see more Black trans men, Black trans women, non-binary people on our TV, not just in America, but in Canada too. I swear we have so much talent here, but we don't get to see that because there's lack of maybe trust in some of us, or I don't know, but there needs to be more of that. Thank you.
I just want to add something to that. And so I'm going to say two things very quickly. First, that like, there's never been a time when Blackness was never queer. Blackness by itself has been queer. And what I mean by that is that Black ways of being have always been non-normative, against the grain. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which, like, so if I had to give an example, I was in Detroit, like this would have been like 20 years ago. And this was for like Hotter Than July, Black Pride. And was invited to a barbecue afterwards. And a friend of mine, while we were doing introductions, was asking Black women asking how she identifies. And he's like, you know, do you identify as lesbian, bi? And she's just like, I'm an honest hoe. And I was just like, girl, I love that right there, because it's like, I'm not going to use the language that's being put on me. I'm just like, yeah, you know, because again, it's like part of the ways in which we survive in the world is by being a mystery, right? Because this idea that somehow we must declare what our sexual preferences are or our orientation, that also is rooted in colonialism. And so, like, again, and so like Shanese, when you're talking about, you know, the figure of the stud, but then also the way in which stud is being claimed by both Black and white folks in a particular kind of way. But again, the stud is part of a particular kind of reproductive logic that is now so queer. The other thing that I was going to say is that the Bible is a very queer book. And the only reason why I'm saying that, and I don't want to get into a biblical debate, but like, if we read Genesis, when Adam and Eve eat the apple, and then, you know, God or Jesus or whatever arrives, and the first question that he asks them, because he's like, I told you not to eat the apple, but you ate the apple. How did you know to call it an apple? What he was trying to say from the very beginning was that, like, if you believe in me, then you're not, and take my word as bond, you're not supposed to define your reality on my behalf. Like, you go bite the apple and now you're going to name it an apple. What if it was an orange? Like it's a very like facetious reading of Genesis, but like that story, basically, it's like, it's telling you right from the very beginning, don't go around spreading what you think is my word, when in fact it's not, because you've never got my permission. And so, yeah, but that can be a whole other conversation. I gotta stop.
It's the next panel.
Yes.
All right, so it sounds like all three of you maybe are coming to a bit of consensus that Blackness does not exist without queerness. So I'm interested really to hear how we feel about the next question, or how we might respond to the next question, which is what spaces, or do spaces exist perhaps, that cater directly to the Black queer experience? Again, whoever wants to tackle it first.
I'll go. I think spaces don't actually exist, but we have to create those spaces. And I've found different avenues to try and create that. Before I transitioned, the story time a little bit, before I transitioned, it was one of my last auditions that I had. And I walked in there because I didn't want to wear a dress anymore, or I didn't want to show any kind of femininity, because it really wasn't who I was. And so I decided to get a haircut, you know, dress in my best boy clothes and walk into an audition. Understanding that women that are masculine exist in all spaces. They could exist in all spaces. And that it doesn't matter whether I come in wearing a dress or I come in wearing a suit and tie and I'm doing the same role. It shouldn't matter. But it did matter 10 years ago, before I started this journey. But that audition really helped me understand the role that I needed to play taking on this journey as I continue to be an artist. And one of the things is I want to create the spaces that I never had in the 20 odd years that I've been in this business, entertainment business, and auditioning in all various stages of my life. I want to create those spaces. And of course, those spaces do, you know, exist. You have Black Pride events. You have, you know, organizations that are, you know, Black queer-led. You have club nights here in Toronto that happen that cater to Blackness and that. There's been a few spaces that have attempted to open up that were Black. I believe there was a space called Canvas or Canva or something like that. That it was like a Black-owned business where Black people can come in space and enjoy themselves. But those spaces don't last because we don't have a lot of support, you know, and that is the problem, is that once we once we get support to build these empires, to build these spaces, to create, to build these the safe spaces to be, then it wouldn't be an issue. Like, for example, last month, there was a huge issue with the National Arts Center for God Is, the play, and there was supposed to be a blackout night. And there was a big thing about people protesting why you need that kind of space, because those kind of spaces is where we can be ourselves and laugh out loud without having those eyes looking at us. Those are safe spaces. So I feel like those spaces could exist, and maybe they do exist if the individual is a Black queer person and they're creating this safe space for that, because not all Black spaces are safe for queer people, for queer Black people. And so as a Black person is to create the space that I need for myself, and perhaps those spaces can help others feel welcome, and maybe they will find ways to create the spaces that I create. I didn't learn that from just me. I learned that from other safe spaces that I've been in, other safe theater rooms where I've got to just be myself as a neurodiverse, dyslexic, Black man of trans experience in a masculine sense, right? And so it's like, I need to create those spaces that welcome me. I'm sure they exist, but I've never known of them lasting. I don't have a space, a physical space. I wish there was one where I can walk into the city and feel like, wow, this is a Black queer space. I used to work at a bar where it was a queer space that was racist, and so it wasn't safe. You know, and this is a place where everybody goes to have parties. They book parties, and it's like, but people don't. And another thing is that people don't talk about the unsafe spaces, and that's a problem with Blackness sometimes, is that we tend to be quiet about certain things when we should be loud about the spaces that are supposed to be for us, but they're not safe for us to be in. End of thought.
Thank you. Who wants to add? Shanese.
Yeah, just to add on that. So I think there's a couple of things. So I would say in Canada, no. I've yet, like, other than like maybe like a workshop here, or someone's like booked when I was in university, someone booked a space and said, okay, we're only going to have like Black queer folks in this space. And of course, again, there was always like an issue with that and students complaining, right? So that very rarely happened when I was on campus. I went to Trent University in Peterborough, which is a very, very white university. For anybody who doesn't know, it's extremely white, right? So it was very hard to create those kind of spaces there. So I think there's a couple things. I think there have been moments where we have attempted to create Black queer spaces and they continuously get gentrified. So a perfect example of that, I'm going to say it, is YYY, Yes, 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 Y'all in Toronto, was originally a very Black queer space. When I started going there, it was a lot of Black queer folks. I don't go anymore. I don't actually know any Black queer folks that really go anymore. None of my friends will go anymore because it has turned into a not only a non-Black space, but like a non-queer space as well. There's a lot of cis and straight white people, non-Black people in that space, right? I think of, you know, Blockorama is a perfect example. I remember for me, that was my pride. For me, that was Black pride. Toronto doesn't have a Black pride. For me, that was Black pride. I didn't want to walk down the street and see a bunch of white naked queers, to be honest. I did not. I wanted to see beautiful Black queer people expressing themselves in all the ways that they can. Blockorama, unfortunately, has turned more predominantly non-Black now. Last year, much non-Black. And to be honest, a lot of my Black friends couldn't even get in. They were in the lines and couldn't even get in. So what does that mean when we're creating a space for Black people? And that's nothing about the organizers, right? They are creating a Black space. Unfortunately, folks are trying to gentrify that space. So again, it's not a reflection of them. It's a reflection of, like, I would say arguably Canadian society, where white Canadians feel they should be entitled to every single space. Even more so than I would say the United States. I feel like a lot of white people in the US are like, go over there, do your thing, right? We're in Canada, we're a multicultural place. Everyone needs to be in every space. My roommate runs a travel group for queer women of color. She specifically made it queer women of color because she knew if she made it for only Black women of color, like Black women, queer Black women, that was probably going to be an issue. So she made it queer women of color. The first cottage weekend that her and her business partner did, a white woman with dreadlocks snuck her way onto the trip and was there at the cottage the entire weekend, being very inappropriate, might I add. But this was something she had, and her friend had helped her trick her way into this. And I think that's a part of the other problem, is that I think as Black folks, because we know what it's like to be left out, we continuously want to create spaces that are acceptable for everybody. And so unfortunately, that means that oftentimes we ourselves are bringing the people we're trying to escape into the spaces that we're trying to create to escape from them. And so I think that's a big problem. I went to Atlanta Black Pride. It was beautiful. I was seeing nothing but Black people. And then every once in a while, I would see this random white person. And I was like, why are you here? And lo and behold, it was probably because their partner brought them or a friend. And I was like, but you have pride. You want to bring your white partner to a space? You have pride. Enjoy that. Black pride is specifically for Black folks, Black queer folks, to see each other and to see themselves and to know that they have a space where they can simply just be. Right? And again, that's not to indicate that any of the white folks there were racist or doing anything horrible, but all of us know the second you walk in a space, you see a white person, you're like, I'm gonna have to adjust in some kind of way. I have to prepare myself just in case they say something racist, right? We want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but the reality is oftentimes we end up getting harmed in that process. So I think it's us having an honest conversation about what a Black only space actually looks like, right? Being honest about that, talking about privileges also. So are we creating spaces that are specifically for dark-skinned Black folks to talk about what it means to be dark-skinned and queer, right? And the reality of what that means, right? Because I know sometimes me being in a space can be a little jarring for folks. I'm a light skin, can be racially ambiguous depending on the space that I'm in. So it's just being honest about that, but actually creating intentional spaces where we say, this is for Black people and we're not budging on it. There's some great folks in the States doing that. Black Boy Complex on Instagram. They're super dope. They create spaces specifically for Black masculine women to go and talk about what it means to be Black and masculine. But yeah, there's like a lot of spaces that I think are trying to be created, more so on the state side. But I think Canada, we have to do a better job. at being honest that we want a space just for us. And that does not mean that we're negating any other queer folks in Canada or other racialized queer folks who might have similarities, but sometimes we need a space that's just for Black people, and it's okay to say that. And I think that we have to start getting to the point where we're okay with being like, I want to be selfish and create this space.
I completely agree with both. I completely agree with both of you. As both of you were talking, and Shanese in particular, when you're talking about last year's Blockorama, I'm assuming that you were there when they, had the DJ shut down the music because we had gotten over capacity or some nonsense. And I'm just like, okay, this is going to be interesting to watch. And so if we want to talk about intersectionality, and I will own it. I was in the VIP section because I was I was on the founding committee when Blockorama started. And so I was up there with like other friends of mine who I've known for like 25, almost 30 years now. And, they shut down the music and asking people to go out and come back in. And I'm just like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Like, I'm a watch you, like, try and see all of these people who have probably been waiting for a very long time to get in, to all of a sudden say, I'm going to come back, like, I'm going to go out and try to get back in. No. I mean, for me, like, as messy as that day was, or that moment was, I was just like, but this tells us our future, because what it means is that we do not need to be any more dependent upon Pride Toronto to create such an event. But this partnership has had like a history, and I can understand why being beholden to it might seem necessary, but I'm just like, there are other avenues where it's just like, yeah, create an event where like 50,000 Black queer people can roll up and not have to worry about this intense policing, which is always what gets my heart pumping whenever I'm there. And so this question around safe space is like, or just creating space, like spaces that cater, it's like, you're only safe if you're within that gated space. And even then, when you're within that gated space, there is no telling what could happen. Because there was one moment where police were coming into the VIP lounge to verify people's IDs to make sure that they corresponded with the badge that we received from Pride Toronto. And I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, I mean, technically, I know that I did try to sneak in one of my friends using someone else's VIP badge, because like they didn't have a photo on it. And so it's just kind of like, yeah, okay, so you're going to be Dr. whatever. But then they like were carding. And I'm just like, these are the contradictions of these spaces where I'm just like, we're partnering with, Blackness Yes is partnering with Pride Toronto. But Pride Toronto is really pretty much dictating who can enter this space. And that's a problem, because there's no autonomy. And this is one of the things that I take up in my research, but something that I also think about in my activism is like, how do we create spaces that do not create these kinds of codependent relationships? Because people who I know from a long time that are just kind of like, it's like, yeah, this is what they're doing this year. And it's just kind of like, you can see that we're all gritting and bearing it. Where like, even when I'm getting carded, I'm just like, girl, don't cuss the police officer. Don't cuss the police officer. You don't want to get arrested on Pride Day. Just show him your health card and let him go anyway. Like, but quite literally, like this, I mean, this does not a safe space for Black queer experience make. And so again, but the other thing that I was going to say when I received the questions was that ultimately, and again, this is kind of like a complicated situation that we find ourselves in is that it's like Black queer community's relationship to capitalism, because that kind of autonomy mostly comes through economic autonomy in some way, the ability to own the space or have certain kinds of economic relationships with different establishments where you can create a notion of a safe space for Black queer experience. And as someone who still thinks of themselves as a Marxist or a socialist, I'm just kind of like, I'm always going to be struggling with that tension around, because like quite literally, like what would Blockorama do or Blackness Yes do if they went rogue and just said, you know what, we're going to apply for funding autonomously and separately, and how would that play out? And so part of the reason why we have to grit and bear these kinds of moments, like the over-policing of Blockorama last year, is precisely because we're still beholden to Pride Toronto holding the purse strings. And yeah, I'm going to stop there because remember, again, talker.
Thank you, Christopher. I have exactly 0 minutes left to ask one final question, but I'm going to anyways right before we jump to the Q&A, because I think this one's really important for myself and hopefully important for all of us to end off on. Give me one sentence. What about Black queer joy? What does it mean to you? Talk to me.
Refusal, full stop.
We will love it. Thank you, Christopher. Who wants to take up the mantle next?
More supportive communities.
I would say Black queerness is infinite. It is infinite.
Thank you all. All right, beautiful. We're gonna jump into the Q&A section of the evening, question and answer. So I have a question here from a participant that is: representation without autonomy is only tokenism. Can you speak to the importance of moving beyond representation? What else do we need for queer Black liberation? Who would like to take that on? Any thoughts?
I think one of the biggest things that I think we need, and I would say this for Black people as a whole, is time. We need the time to heal. We need the time to grow. We need the time to build. I think if folks could give us that time, give us that space. And to be honest, I don't know how that would be, because how do you just hand out time? But I think really just whether that's giving up money for that space to have that time to heal, right? Like I think oftentimes folks are like, how do we help? Money. Like Black queer folks are putting their lives on the line. So put your pockets on the line, because we need it. We need it. Like what CJ just said, like what would we do if we had the money to create that space, right? Like I think a lot of folks have a lot of access to resources and privileges that we as Black queer folks do not have. So for me, it's giving up that space and time, right? Like I really think about that. I think about like funding. When we're thinking about where funding goes, how very little do we see funding go towards Black queer initiatives, Black queer people. So yeah, I would say like time, give us money, give us space, like allow for that. Cause I think healing is such a big part of what we need for Black queer liberation. Cause I think even as Black people, we already have to heal from generational trauma, but like, what does it mean to heal from the oppression and suppression of your identity, not just from like colonial powers, but also from your own people? And so, yeah, I think it's really just like having the time and the space and the money to heal.
I think that access to resources is really important. You just mentioned that, Shanese, but also like not feeling like a token is like inviting more people, you know, and not just having one person, you know, in theater take up, you know, all the seasons in because you have your one Black person. Like, that doesn't make sense. And so it's not just inviting that one person, it's like having resources for everybody to learn the skills, and having learning opportunities for people, and inviting people into your companies. It's inviting people into your spaces. Yeah, definitely more resources to learn, free resources, because times are hard, you know?
I agree with both of you. And I mean, just to kind of circle back in terms of, I mean, the last question that was asked of us in terms of joy, like when I said refusal, it's like refusal of the term. What I was thinking in my answer was just simply refusal of the terms of engagement. And so what does it mean to see, you know, a whole bunch of representations of Black, queer, or trans women's lives represented? So like Shanese, you had mentioned, I think both of you might have mentioned pose for it, like for instance, but we could also, you know, talk about drag race, etc. Like, what does it mean when we appear on screen? And it's not tokenism, but it's still locked in a particular kind of narrative that makes no room for joy. Don't get me wrong, I love Pose. Like, and it's a very, very beautiful series, but there's always this part of me that like cringes in my heart some moments watching that show, where I'm just like, I understand why my Black, queer, and trans friends are watching this show and getting all the feels, but what are people doing like that are not of this experience? How are they taking in this knowledge? Because Pose is also very much a documentary. It looks like drama, but it's documentary. And it's a document of a particular kind of moment in time during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so thinking, which I lived through. And so thinking about the ways in which it's like, yes, we've got this very profound representation that's not tokenistic, that actually is quite revolutionary. But then what do we, like, does this necessarily shift anything in terms of our day-to-day lives, in terms of what people are willing to do or put on the line to support Black queer liberation?
And I just want to add something super quick. I'll be super quick, but I was just going to say, when we're talking about like representation and creating the spaces for folks to be in, the biggest part of that is making sure that you've done the work to make that space as safe as you possibly can. We have too much representation with people also being traumatized in the process. And like, especially when we're telling our own stories, when I think of the documentary, I think it was, well, the show When They See Us on Netflix. I haven't watched it. I'm not gonna lie, I haven't watched it. I don't need to be traumatized. I heard about the story, I read about it. But the fact that the actors were so traumatized from acting it out that they had to then go get therapy, like, I want representation without us re-traumatizing ourselves or the people that are creating the space traumatizing us in the process. So it's just like a quick little thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for adding that. Okay, next question. What does an anti-racist, revolutionary Black queer future look like? Christopher, I see a smile cross your face ever so slowly. Would you like
I guess I clearly have a tell. No. So I mean, part of the reason why I guess I was grimacing or whatnot is that I have certain kinds of questions around what we mean by anti-racist, in the same way that I have misgivings around how we are now currently talking about equity, diversity, inclusion, and what that means, and whether or not we're all on the same page. And so, you know, if you asked me this question 20 years ago, I think I would have more faith in a certain idea of anti-racist and what that meant. I mean, when I was in grad school, I was a TA for sociology of race and racism. Like, I was doing the work of anti-racism, but then there's the real reality of But what if I cannot, make someone not be racist anymore? Then do I need to invest my energy into something called anti-racist? Because it's always going to be a butting of heads. And so can I imagine liberation outside of that scheme? It's very much in the same way that like equity, diversity, and inclusion, I'm just like, I believe in equity. Whenever we pair it with diversity and inclusion, I'm just like, we live in Canada, diversity is already self-evident. And whenever we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about power relations. And so suggesting to yourself that we've met the goal to address something like anti-Black racism through something called inclusion is actually reproducing the very same dynamics, because I don't necessarily need to be included. I just don't want to be prevented from doing what I want to do within whatever particular institution I'm entering into. Because again, inclusion presumes like a certain kind of relationship of power. And I know this can be a kind of difficult thing for some folks to hear because these are the new buzzwords, right? Equity, diversity, inclusion, but there's soft words, there's soft gestures in my mind. And so if we're thinking in terms of a revolutionary Black queer future, sure, we can talk about what we think about in terms of inclusion, but doing it backwards and asking ourselves constantly, who's being excluded when we're creating this space? And so it's not about suggesting, oh, well, we're just going to embrace everyone, but actually legitimately saying every time that we create a space or create anything, what kinds of questions, experiences are already being elided by virtue of that gesture? I'll just leave it at that.
Actually, I feel like you're just speaking my mind right now because I've become so disillusioned with DE&I, it's not even funny. Now, don't tell any of my clients that because I'm still getting booked. Because to be fair, I still believe in creating or putting in the work to create as safe spaces as possible. I still want to give people the tools to make sure that they're not constantly harming folks. So I haven't been disillusioned with that. But I think much like you, when I started university, I remember I ran for anti-racism commissioner on my student union, and I was like, I'm gonna end racism at Trent. Because I really believe that I could put in the work. I was taught very quickly that wasn't the case, right? But when you're young and you're learning about all of these terms for the first time, it feels like you can do everything or anything with them, right? Like you finally feel like you have the language to address the things that you have been facing, right? And language is very important, but action usually has to come in behind that. So this question I think is asked on every panel, what does a Black future look like for you? What does an Indigenous future look like for you, right? And for me, it's always the same answer. We're just existing. I'm just living my life and I'm thriving and I'm with my partner and I'm with my dog and I'm watching shows on TV that don't dehumanize me and I'm not watching, people who look like me dead on my phone. I just want to exist. I want to, how white people wake up in the morning and they're just like, look at the sun. Let me go get some coffee. That's what I want. That's really what I want. I'm so tired, y'all. All my life I've had to fight. I'm really feeling like the color purple right now. I just want to rest. I just want to exist. I don't want to have to fight anything. I don't want to have to fight a single thing. My what that future looks like for Black, queer, racialized, disabled folks, everybody, is that we are just existing. And we are thriving and we are happy and we're not dealing with things like poverty. And of course, there's all these steps that need to go into that, right? So we would have to dismantle the system and we'd have to combat, capitalism. And there's a bunch of things. I know there's a lot of steps that would get us to that future. But if you ask me what it looks like, shoot, I'm laying on my couch in some panties and a t-shirt and I'm watching TV and I'm smoking a blunt with my partner and my dog's running back and forth because he wants to go outside. And that's just it. And I'm not thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to open my phone and see another dead Black person. And I'm not thinking, oh my God, another Indigenous woman or girl's gone missing. And I'm not thinking another Black trans person has lost their life. I want us all to live. I want our expectancy like age to extend. I want us all to be expected to live to 99 if that's what you want to live to. Like I don't want our age expectancy to be 34 for Black trans women. I don't want that. So for me, it's just we're living, we're existing. You're doing what you want to do. You're doing what you want to do. You're doing what you want to do. We're all doing what we individually want to do, as long as it doesn't affect other people in a negative way. That's my future. It's nothing special, nothing grand. It's just that.
Love it, Shanese. That's a very special future. Another mic drop moment for you. Tsholo, do you want to follow that up?
Mic drop. I feel it. I also just want to exist. I just want to be a dad to my kid. You know what I'm saying? I just want to teach her and have fun, and I want to frolic. You know those videos where you see Black men frolic? I want to frolic. I want to pick flowers. You know what I'm saying? I want a studio where I can like paint all day. You know, that's what I want. I don't want to worry about exactly what you said. I don't want to be traumatized. I don't want even our stories on our films, on our theaters to regurgitate all of these traumas. Like we know, we get it. We're living through it, right? We may not have lived through, you know, slavery times, but it wasn't far away. We totally get it. And absolutely, like I see a world where I don't have to feel discriminated against or, you know, marginalized. I see a free world, but are we actually gonna get that in my lifetime? I don't know. You know, who knows? But I could only do what I gotta do. And if I gotta, you know, enjoy a moment where I am painting or doing a TikTok dance, then I guess I'll take those moments, because it is a battle, y'all. It's been a battle. Like I said, we're not the first ones to be saying these things, you know, in South Africa, the same things. We were fighting for freedom, for Blackness, for our country. People here, you know, apartheid that's happening in Canada that we don't want to talk about, it's still happening to Indigenous people here. We don't talk about it, you know? But I guess we just want that sense of normalcy. Everybody wants that. You're right. I want to walk down the street without looking, you know? I want to walk by some old people or, you know, aged people and not have them grab their purses. I want freedom, not to feel like I am a walking, like, TikTok time bomb or terrorist is what I sometimes feel like. You know, I'm just a normal guy. I want to be a good partner to my partner. I want to raise my child. I want to take care of my parents, you know, and make them laugh in their old age. Simple shit, you know, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What a way to end us off. We have a few minutes left. So before we get away from here, I want to just open it up to the three of you for any final thoughts you might have to share with each other, with the group that we have here today.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh,
I was just.
I keep on forgetting that I'm on camera, and so I was just kind of, oh, you can't see me about to like open my mouth. No, I was just going to say that because whenever I'm invited to these kinds of occasions, it's like I don't want to sound like I'm cynical, because believe it or not, I am hopeful. But I guess my understanding of hope sometimes it differs from what people might imagine. Like for me, a revolutionary future is that 20 years from now, I can just be a really boring Black gay man that, like, you know, goes to the street and buys some flowers to, you know, put in my living room, and I can watch my shows. Like that for me is revolution. And I understand that, like, to get to that place, sometimes we have to be critical about the paths that we choose to get there. But I'm just like, I'm still hopeful. So I don't want anyone like in the audience thinking, oh my God, he's cynical. Like, just critical.
Yeah, no, to go off what you said, I think for me, I'm kind of, there was a point where I was just like, none of this is real. None of this is going to happen. Like I think all of us go through that phase when you're doing quote unquote equity work, is like, there comes a moment where you're like, this feels impossible. Like it feels like nothing's going to change. And I think what's really important, what you said, is like, have hope, and it's about redirecting that hope into a space that makes sense for us. For me, I'm no longer, like, we were talking about buzzwords, decolonizing. I'm no longer trying to decolonize a single space. I don't think it's real. You can't decolonize something that's inherently colonial. For me, I'm like, I want to shift that energy and that hope that I had for all of these really colonial anti-Black spaces and shift it into creating spaces that are actually by us, for us. You know, a little bit of FUBU, for us, by us. Like, that's where I want my energy to go, instead of getting angry and giving up, which I think is often sometimes things that can happen with us, right? Because we're just tired. It's so easy to just say, I'm done. I have a lot of friends who have left the equity world to go into IT. They're like, I can't do nonprofits anymore. I can't do this work anymore. I'm burnt out. And I'm like, how much time and energy have they stolen from us to, quote unquote, make their spaces safer? And I've started to realize we're actually just making the spaces safer for them. It's safer, like when we come and talk about queer phobia, it's now safer for white queer folks. When we talk about dismantling, you know, the wage gap and misogyny, it's for white women, right? So I think it's redirecting a lot of that energy into the spaces that we create for ourselves. And it's not, again, to say that we can't interact with other folks and create those spaces in conjunction with them. But like, for me, it's really about turning that energy inward and into community. And I think, just to echo also what both of you have said about, like, you just want to exist, right? And what I said, when I think about the moments that I feel the most free, like when I think about freedom for me, it is those moments where I'm not thinking about my identity. I'm not thinking about how I have to move through the world. I'm simply moving. So when I'm at Carnival and I'm on the road and I'm, you know, I'm at Jab Jab and I'm at Juve, in that moment is when I feel the most free. When I'm dancing with my friends at a party, even at Blackorama, because when Patrice came on, that for me in that moment was freedom. Right. And I think that's what liberation and freedom looks like for so many of us, is making those moments all moments and not just little glimpses of it. Because I think as Black people, as queer people, we get glimpses of freedom, but we haven't actually gained freedom.
What a great piece to end off on there, Shanese. Thank you so much. We're just hitting 8:32, so I'm going to hand it back to Shayna to take us out for the evening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful panel. I was nodding my head and giving you all props, even though you couldn't see me. But thank you so much, all of you, Louis, Sulu, Shanice, and Christopher. Thank you for being part of the space and cultivating this discussion in such an honest and interesting and inspiring way. We really appreciate your contributions to this caucus and the important work you do. I sincerely hope that everyone watching enjoyed themselves. As well, a big thank you for all of our volunteers who help make these conversations possible. So please join us for our next panel, Trust Black Women, a keynote with Elle Jones on Saturday, March 4th from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. This is a live event in the Fraser Auditorium at Laurentian University. As well, don't forget to check out the Soul and Spirits Open Mic Night tomorrow, Friday, March 3rd from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. at the Alibi Room on Durham Street. It will be delivered in French, but all are welcome to attend at that time. For more Black Futures Week information, please consult our website and stay tuned to our social media. Thank you again to our sponsors, Black Lives Matter Canada, Blackbird Studio, Cambrian College, Canadian Mental Health Association, Sudbury, Manitoulin, Canadian Race Relations, Centre de Santé Communautaire du Grand Sudbury, la Centre Victoria pour Femmes, Coalition to End Violence Against Women, Compass, Copy, Future North, Futur du Nord, the Government of Canada, Laurentian University Equity, Diversity and Human Rights Office, MacEwan School of Architecture, Mental Health and Addictions Program of Health Sciences North, and Swakopmund Native Friendship Center, the Nickel Refillery, Papaya Pops, Public Health Sudbury and Districts, Réseau Access Network, HIV, Hepatitis, Health and Social Services, Services Sociaux et de Santé pour l'Hépatite et le VIH, Yes Theatre, YMCA of Northeastern Ontario, YWCA Sudbury. In the spirit of the conference theme, Black Futures, Learn from the Past, take action in the present, build the future. Thank you for joining us and have a splendid rest of your evening.